What's up guys, Houndish here, and today we're going to jump in and talk about how seasons are going in Year 3 of Destiny 2. So, we've now had Shadowkeep and the accompanying Season of Undying, and we're now well into Season of Dawn with a pretty decent sample of Year 3 content to discuss. So, I think based on a lot of the feedback in the community at the moment, it is a pretty good time to round up some of what players think could be improved about the game, some of the community complaints and pain points in the game right now, because yeah, it's safe to say there are plenty of them. So we'll discuss some of what is working, of course, but we're going to focus on seasonal activity repetition, rewards and fear of missing out, quests, the roadmap, PvP frustrations, the Artifact and Armor 2.0 systems, and then the seasonal conversation would also include things like Eververse and a few other things. So I will of course be giving a lot of my thoughts, but be sure to let us know what you guys think in the comment section as well. We do all have slightly different interests, frustrations, and opinions, so I'm going to do my best to represent the comments and feedback that seem most prominent, but otherwise definitely give your thoughts below. So we're in Year 3 of Destiny 2 now, and Bungie have told us that they plan to continue to support D2 for the foreseeable future. But we also know that the developer and publisher Bungie are in a very different position to the one that they were in a couple of years ago. Bungie do have a lot of players and content in the game to support, which considering their commitment to D2 is why they're continuing with this seasonal model for the game. Also, Bungie's position and the changing market for the game is why they've made decisions and big moves like going free to play. So, while we do have certain expectations, that does have a pretty huge influence on how Bungie do things and what they can achieve. And it's worth bearing that in mind when we talk about some of the core pillars and problems or opportunities to improve seasons specifically in D2. So, I think one of the current challenges with producing seasonal content for Bungie is that repetition in the core of the seasonal activity content. Looking at the Sundial, it is very similar to Menagerie, which of course was a great mode when it launched, and these smaller modes like Reckoning, even Forges to an extent, they haven't been the most exciting modes ever, but when they actually launched, they gave us just about enough to do. However, looking at Year 3, we had Vex Offensive, a very basic Horde mode, and now Sundial, which is really very similar, but is maybe a little more reminiscent of Menagerie. And I think the primary issue now is that players are starting to get a little bit tired of this formula. I think it's similar with the rewards in the game. Bungie have crafted these really cool end games around certain loot tables, things like the Chalice of Opulence, the obelisks, the various upgrades and rewards that you can get there. And while they do work, because we're getting them season over season in a very similar format, players do get tired. I think as well that there is a loot issue beginning to emerge for veteran players, where there are just so many weapons in the game that it becomes difficult to find new things that really stand out and impact your gameplay in a significant way. When it comes to DLC weapons, Bungie have made efforts to introduce new perks and archetypes, but for most players, we end up with one or two standouts per season, and then otherwise there is this kind of fear of missing out element with rewards for seasonal activities. And I think some players do feel a little bit pressurized by timed content drops. Maybe it's the inability to obtain god rolls, or even to continue to, right? Because after this season, as far as we know, there's going to be no more farming for a god rolled line in the sand, for example. And so it is really hard to summarize this section, but I think it comes down to how meaningful the content feels, how exciting the rewards are, and the question of, does the fact that much of this content is limited time actually serve to remove player agency and replace a lot of it with a feeling of kind of urgency that isn't always met with that meaningfulness? I think one of our recent examples of this would be the Corridors of Time puzzle. It got a lot of people in the community really excited for a prolonged period of time. The sense of mystery was there, and players read into that, naturally, so we assumed that this was going to result in some crazy reward, and by extension, you then had folks staying up for days on end trying to amass all of the data needed to actually solve the maze. Of course, on the flip side of that, because of the nature of the puzzle, some folks did feel a little bit alienated, like they couldn't really take part, and I think if you aren't a Discord user, or a regular of many of the forums and subnetworks of players, then yeah, it would be pretty difficult to get a sense of what was happening and then actually get involved. But regardless, the maze was solved and it unlocked Bastion, but this resulted in quite a lot of disappointment, and I think that's where the urgency versus meaningfulness kind of broke down, and primarily it's because we knew about Bastion already. A lot of these puzzles or quests nearly always result in an unexpected reward, and so I can understand why there was some disappointment. Bungie definitely tried something different, and like Niobe Labs, I'm sure that it has been a pretty significant learning experience, but I'm also starting to feel like it's safe to say that the "you had to be there" model that Luke Smith referenced definitely seems to work best when it isn't forced into small time windows, but also when the reward is a complete surprise that kind of matches that effort. And so, let me know how you guys feel about repetition in that core seasonal content, but also fear of missing out, and urgency versus reward in seasonal content right now, because it does present an important list of potential issues for Bungie to tackle with this new model. On the subject of repetition though, a conversation at the moment which comes up a lot is XP grind. It's looking like a lot of players agree that earning XP could be improved. Currently, the bounty grind can get pretty monotonous, and of course that's the main way to earn large amounts of XP. And I think having a certain focus on bounties is important. It's also worth remembering that we did ask for bounties for quite a long time to be made more valuable and important in the game like they were in D1, so it's worth bearing that in mind. But regardless, I do think we need a little bit more variety in XP sources. For example, how about exotic or ritual weapon quests actually provide substantial XP gains when you complete them? The same could be applied for objectives in DLC content, so what about a weekly bonus in an activity like the Ascendant Challenge, for example? Maybe Bungie could look at creating several or even a ton of different XP bonuses which apply to different activities and roll out week over week or a few times a week. And these could actually encourage almost any content in the game. So, for example, one week it could pop up and say, return to the Whisper mission for a weekly XP bonus. Once unlocked, the bonus will provide a diminishing increase in XP when completing pinnacle activities throughout the week. And instead of rewarding just 12k XP, like a weekly bounty, why not go kinda crazy and have this reward, 50,000 XP or more from one selected task? Something like that could kind of engage us in a wider variety of D2's content. And once again, these are just ideas. They could be fraught with complexity in terms of actually implementing into the game, but I think we've at least explored other possibilities, and I'd be curious to hear what you guys think about new ways and different ways to earn XP in the game. Now, an area of the game which has been a little bit underloved in general, or should I say pretty underloved overall, and then continues to be fairly underloved inside of seasonal content at the moment, of course it's going to be the Crucible! Initially, we should say that there has been some level of renewed focus on the game, but right now, aside from what Bungie might be doing in the future, so, if they're making trials or some other endgame thing that's going to be introduced later down the road, that's absolutely awesome, but PvP continues to suffer in terms of quality of life right now. I don't want to get too sandbox heavy, but I think most of us can agree that in one way or another, depending on our PvP habits, the Crucible is definitely missing some endgame stuff, right? Ritual weapons are good, but they're just one layer, and it feels like for PvP invested players, the rewards initially, like endgame currency, shards and all of those kind of things, are pretty scarce inside of PvP, but also other Crucible-specific rewards feel like they're lacking, and for endgame competitive, when we look at the Crucible side of the game in contrast to endgame raiding, there aren't really any new pinnacle or unique rewards for PvP players to really flex. Previously, we did have weapons like Not Forgotten and Recluse, and while they absolutely could stomp the sandbox, right, both of those weapons in one way or another turned out to be pretty problematic, especially after they remained in the game for very long periods of time. But they did provide that chase and prestige, and I don't think that's necessarily something that you only get when a weapon is broken, right? When you look at Trials from D1, the weapons we had there are an example, and that whole pinnacle endgame and aspirational element of PvP feels like it's missing in D2 in comparison. So that's my core feedback, and there is also a lot of discussion about sandbox tuning, how long those updates still take to get in the game, and then of course Trials, a true PvP endgame. These are all questions that remain, and currently the seasonal model, I feel, is struggling to support Crucible in the kinds of ways that PvP dedicated players would really like to see. And for many, there doesn't necessarily seem to be that massively renewed focus on PvP. That could all change, but for now, let us know what you think about Crucible in its current state below. Now though, let's talk about artifacts, Armor 2.0, and sandbox breakages. So the new artifact and the systems around it are still relevant to the conversation. I would say that largely in PvE, the artifacts, the armor system, the builds and possibilities that are being created are really fun. We could totally ask for more variation, right? More brand new kind of overpowered perks like Oppressive Darkness that we had last season. But I think on the most part, these systems are doing their job pretty well. Even the broken stuff in a lot of cases tends to be enjoyed, and for now is largely successful. I think the main feedback would still be around lifting the affinity limitations on Armor 2.0. Bungie do have multiple reasons for having put the affinity system in place in the first instance, but given the feedback on 2.0 affinity and the system otherwise being largely very popular, I do think that Bungie still need to work on that affinity system. I also think that artifact reset costs, especially combined with speccing builds, the costs accrued when you slot mods, upgrade gear, and then start changing those builds on the fly. Yeah, honestly, I think Bungie could still adjust those reset costs. And our next point is connected to this, but is more about loot specifically. I think that players would enjoy having more ways to get Ascendant Shards in the game still. Ordeal Nightfalls have been fantastic in terms of an addition to that whole corner of PvE, but back to the idea of varied bonus XP objectives, and for Crucible and Gambit resets, and also let's remember that focused PvP players can't really earn that currency in Crucible, aside from gaining XP for the pass. I think that there are opportunities to introduce some of the upgrade currencies into more places in the game. Bungie could even introduce very low chances in seasonal activities to get Ascendant Shards dropped. I totally think that there are opportunities to improve the system, especially since these are really kind of important replayability elements of the game at the moment. So once again, give us your thoughts about that. Now though, let's move on to Eververse, and some players will forever despise the story in Destiny, and I can kind of understand why. But I think in reality, when we look at how much content Destiny gets versus other games, and that's both in its season pass and over time, Destiny does get quite a lot of content in comparison to quite a few AAA titles, live games or otherwise. I personally understand why the story's there, and it's pretty obvious that, especially now going it alone, Eververse does contain revenue that Bungie can use. My main complaint would still be the lack of cosmetics in the game, which come from gameplay. We've spoken a lot about themed gear in the past, enemy-themed loot, which was largely very popular in D1, but is much less present in D2, and then, currently, with certain strikes in the game not actually having exclusive drops, or others still missing the same kind of cosmetic edge and theme that we got from strike drops in D1. Despite all of that, we still end up with Bungie offering items like this as an ornament in the Eververse store. Clearly, it's really important for Bungie to be able to tempt players like this, but I do find it kind of insane that after years of feedback about getting drops like this via gameplay again, we do see items like this Cabal-themed unique loot in the Eververse store. However, at the same time, there are no similar items actually dropping in the game, potentially outside of something like the Season Pass. And so I think to offset some of the frustration that players have about Eververse, Bungie could actually take a sample of the new exotic rewards per season and add them as random chance items in Strikes, Crucible, Sundial, or wherever. Of course, it would have to be the items that go up for Bright Dust, and not Silver, because that would cause a lot of issues, but that's just one possibility. Also, Bungie, as a sort of goodwill measure, I guess, could kind of introduce new items like fan-favorite exotic class items. These were really popular in D1, and if Bungie were to come out and say, this season, a new exotic class item is available for each class in the seasonal activity, and that could be as a rare drop, or even better, a pursuit item which you unlock, and then has high chances of getting really high stats, and also come with a kind of insane enemy theme, kind of like the Gauntlets ornament that we just spoke about, but of course based on the theme of the season. That's just one idea, but I think if Bungie find a way to offset the fact that Eververse gets all of these unique themed items, and even market it as such, right? Sure, there's cool Eververse stuff, but in this instance there would at least be a few similar dope-looking exotic items elsewhere in the game, which will give players more of a sense that these kind of rewards don't have to be exclusive to Eververse or Season Passes. That's part of the issue to some degree, that very few things that look as cool as Eververse items actually drop in the game, so I think there are opportunities to ease some of the frustration that Eververse actually causes for players. The final point that I would really make here is that we have covered most of the seasonal content in one form or another. We touched on the main activity, some of the repetition, the difficulty and the depth of that stuff, as well as the rewards. We spoke a little bit about story, and story I think is one of the elements that Bungie have been doing really well. Credit due on the improvements to story and lore, especially Forsaken and beyond. Aside from that, you may specifically have complaints about things like a lack of factions, which I totally agree. Factions deserve to be brought back and fleshed out properly in the game. You may also have specific complaints about balance or returning exotics, and Destiny of course is a huge game, so it's very difficult to summarize all of the key things that matter about the game in any one time. And so separate to what we've spoke about, there are other huge parts of the game which you may have thoughts on, and so for the final time, let us know what you reckon in the comment section. But I'd summarize for now that seasons on the most part are doing a lot of stuff right. They provide us with a lot of content, relatively speaking of course, And we're maybe getting a little bit less content overall than last year, although it is pretty marginal outside of comparing something like Forsaken and Shadowkeep. However, because the content drops are slightly smaller and are being produced relatively rapidly, that is presenting new challenges for Bungie in varying the content, and also given that Bungie have lost the support of 2 smaller Activision studios, it does mean that we end up with a little bit less content per season, but also fewer fixes for long-running issues, less likelihood of revamps to factions, for example, because unless they made a season focused on the factions, it would probably just be too much work to do outside of another much bigger DLC drop. So, of course, Bungie are working against those problems, but also the fact that there is simple player fatigue. I remember in Destiny 1 we had big periods of time where things got really quiet, and while Trials on the weekend would bring folks back, you could have a couple of months of nearly nothing on the calendar. We also had phases like when the Division 1 dropped, and vast numbers of players went for a month or 2 to play other games. And I do genuinely believe that those periods were actually really healthy for Destiny, because Destiny was still incredibly competitive, and frankly, better in the long run than most of the similar games around it. So having a month or 2 away from D1 for me and my clan, I remember it actually really highlighted how good Destiny was, gave us a break from the game. And while of course that is not an excuse for Bungie to not make good content, because it isn't, I do think that we all play a lot of Destiny, and I know for a long time in D2, no game has really captured my interest for more than a couple of weeks at a time. And so naturally grinding over and over and over again isn't always the healthiest thing to do. So if you feel like taking a break, go ahead and take it. That's essentially what I'm saying. On the most part, for me, in the past it has made Destiny more fun to play again, so otherwise, as for some of what the community think Bungie can do to make the actual game better, we have discussed a lot of that in this video, so beam your thoughts down into the comment section. But if you've enjoyed the conversation, a rating below really helps me out, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to get subscribed if you have enjoyed the video, so that I can bring you more content like this, as well as news, guides, and all that good stuff related to the world of Destiny. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in, and whatever you guys get up to, I hope you have an awesome day.